I feel like you've been here all day, and I should start off with a joke to just kind of loosen the mood. That's what they say speakers are supposed to do, but I stopped doing that. Because the other day I was speaking, and as I started off, I was comparing lawyers to jerks. And the moment I put lawyers and jerks in the same category, this guy in the right front just kind of tensed up. And you could tell he was upset and he was angry. Through my whole talk, he was just kind of staring me down. Well, the moment the talk was finished, I stepped down. He came right up to me. He said, "I'm offended at your message." He said, "I can't believe you compare lawyers to jerks." I said, "Well, are you a lawyer?" He said, "No, I'm a jerk." I was flying here, actually, I was in Chicago for a day, and I came here, and I was sitting in the airport, and I heard the phone ring. Someone forgot to put on vibrate, and I turned to the guy next to me, I do a double take, and he pulls up his wrist and starts talking into his wrist. Have you seen these new, they're like tape you put in your wrist, and they have technology in them like a phone implanted in your wrist. Well, I don't know about you, but I hadn't seen that before. So when the guy was off the phone, I turned and I said, "My goodness, is that a phone in your wrist? That's incredible. Tell me about it." He's like, "I'm busy. I don't have time. Sorry, don't interrupt me." I was like, "Whoa, okay." So I had to go to the bathroom. I asked him to wash my bags. He said that was fine. I went to the bathroom. I came back, and I had toilet paper dangling down from my ear. I sat down. He looked at me. He said, "What's that?" I said, "Don't worry about it. I'm getting a fax." If you're under 30 and you don't know what a fax is, ask somebody over 30. Well, I'm glad to see your spirits are still alive and you're with me. This is very important and this is very good. Because if you didn't laugh, I would at least have the confidence that God was laughing after hearing that song. But I'm feeling better that you're laughing with me as well. I actually want to kick off by asking a question. I want you to think of something. I want you to think of the toughest conversation you've ever had. So maybe it was a relational conversation or something financially you had to share with somebody or to do with your health, just something you feared and you kind of hoped that the conversation would just kind of take care of itself and you didn't have to deal with it, but you knew it was. Well, one of the toughest conversations that I had in my life was a conversation with my father. And to understand why it's so difficult, you have to know something a little bit about my dad. Now, a few of you have asked me and figured out with the last name McDowell who I might be related to. Yes, my mother is Dottie McDowell. And my father's this guy by the name of Josh, who spent over 50 years working with Crew, and the tagline of his ministry is telling the world the truth. Speaking, writing, debating, you name it, proclaiming the truth around the globe. When I was about 18, 19 years old, I started to read some stuff on the internet that challenged the beliefs I had learned growing up. And frankly, it kind of rocked me. I didn't feel prepared for it. I didn't have an answer for it. And it was deeply unsettling. I started to ask the questions that a lot of kids growing up in Christian homes ask. Do I really believe this? Is this my faith? Is this true? What if I'm wrong about this? So I knew it was time to be honest with my dad. We were in Breckenridge, Colorado, beautiful skiing town. And we went out for some coffee. And I remember just turning to my dad, just kind of dreading it, not knowing what he was going to say. Didn't want to disappoint him. And I looked at my dad. I said, "Dad, I got to tell you something. I want to know the truth. But I'm not sure I believe that Christianity is really true." And he looked at me. He goes, "Son, I think that's great." And I looked back at him and I said, "Did you hear anything I just said?" Right? Like some of my students have mastered pretending that they're listening, but in their minds they're doing something else. I know none of you would do that, but my students are good at it. And he goes, "Yeah, son, I heard exactly what you said." And he said, "Here's why I think this is good." He said, "Look, I can sense you really want to know truth. If you really seek after truth, you're going to be led to Jesus because Jesus is the truth." He said, "You know your mom and I love you no matter what. You don't have to worry about that." And then he gave me some advice I'll never forget. He said, "Ultimately, you get to decide for yourself what you believe, but don't reject the things you've learned growing up unless you think they're not true." So I know a lot of kids who grow up in the church, who grow up in Christian families, who grow up their homeschool, go to Christian schools, and they rebel just for the sake of rebelling. My dad was saying, "You're better than that. Truth is supreme. Only reject it if you really think it's not true." And that was great advice. And that's what I've tried to do in my own life. And that's what every young person has to do, is really own their own faith and find out why they know it's true if they're going to make a difference in the world. Now, those of you who know my father's story, he set out to disprove Christianity and to show that it was false. My journey was a little different. I was kind of taking examination from within Christianity, seeing if the faith I had been raised in was intellectually grounded and could really make sense of the world. Now, my dad and I, in one sense, our journeys could not be any greater, but on the other hand, we had something in common. We both began our spiritual quest by considering the claims of Christianity. You know why that's important? Because tonight I want to take you on a journey with me. 3 years ago, I had a chance to speak at Berkeley to about 500 college students. And then I got to speak also to a small group of skeptics who invited me. And this group was called SANE, Students for Non-Religious Ethos. All these students get together and they plan events about how they can get rid of religion starting at Berkeley. Here I come showing up with some students and myself, speaking to their group and then taking questions for an hour. And I thought, what could I say to this group? I could argue the Bible's true. I could argue that Jesus is God. I could make a case for the resurrection. I thought, you know what? I'm going to do something different. I'm going to make a case to these students and try to persuade them that if they are genuine spiritual seekers, they would begin their quest just by examining Christianity. That's it. And I gave them 4 reasons why an intelligent person on a spiritual quest would first consider the claims of Christ. I want to kind of take you on this journey with me to point out 4 things unique and different about Christianity. You might be sitting there going, I'm already a Christian, what's the point? Well, look, hopefully, as we heard in the talk before, that we're in conversation and we're in relationships with people who aren't Christians, and sometimes be able to say, you know what, can I just show you some things different about Christianity? Even if you don't believe it, I want you to understand what Christianity is about. But I also want to help all of us in this room maybe be a little bit more thoughtful and understand why the spiritual decisions we've made actually make sense and be reflective about our own journeys. The interesting thing is I'm not the only one who's saying that it makes sense to begin a spiritual quest with Christianity. Some of you might recognize the name Antony Flew. Do you know for 50 years, for 5 decades, Antony Flew was the most widely read philosophical atheist in the world. He first presented a paper with his objections against God at the Socratic Club at Oxford before C.S. Lewis. And he basically said the idea of God is meaningless. But then he died maybe, 2 or 3 years ago, and shortly before he died, he released a book in 2007. And the book was called There Is a God: Why the World's Most Notorious Atheist Changed His Mind. Now, insofar as we know, he never became a Christian. He believed in God, but he said this: I think the Christian religion is the one religion that most clearly deserves to be honored and respected. There's nothing like the combination of a charismatic figure like Jesus and a first-class intellectual like St. Paul. If you're wanting omnipotence to set up a religion, this is the one to beat. I said to these students, if you're serious about seeking truth, let me persuade you with 4 reasons that you should just begin, that's it, by considering Christianity. So the first point I made related to a movie that came out about the year 2000 with Antonio Banderas in it. Sorry, Richard, that's my best attempt at an accent. With Antonio Banderas, and Antonio Banderas played a former Green Beret who became a Catholic priest. The movie's called The Body. The reason it's called The Body is because he'd recently become a Christian, but they find this tomb in Jerusalem with a body in it that dates to the 1st century. The body was crucified in a rich man's tomb, and they find a coin from the era of Pilate. So obviously they think it's who? Okay, most of you got it, but let me just give you a heads up. If you don't know the answer to a question at an evangelism conference, just say Jesus. All right? My daughter actually, she's at a Christian school. She's 6, so she's in 1st grade. Last year she was in kindergarten. And to start off class, the teacher would, this is where you need to learn. You don't blurt out, you raise your hand. So the teacher said, class, I want you to raise your hand. I'll call on you and give the answer. So she started with something easy. She said, class, what's gray, has a big bushy tail, and climbs in trees? Nothing. She thought, this is strange. Class, raise your hand. I'll call on you. What's gray, has a big bushy tail, and climbs in trees? Nothing. She said, class, raise your hand. 5-year-olds have to know this. What's gray, has a big bushy tail, and climbs in trees? Finally, one of my daughter's classmates, little Johnny, raised his hand back. She said, yes, Johnny, what is it? He said, I'll say Jesus, but it sure sounds like a squirrel to me. Now, in this movie, The Body, they thought they found the body of Jesus. So within the movie, they go into an entire uproar, and the Catholic Church, goes crazy about this, and it's a conspiracy, and they try to hide it. Why? Because Paul said something that I have never found an equivalent statement made in any of the major religions of the world. Have you ever realized how radical of a statement Paul makes in 1 Corinthians 15? If you're setting up a religion, this is a really bad idea to say something like this. 1 Corinthians 15, Paul, verses 14, he says, if Christ is not risen, our faith is what? It's worthless. It's in vain. We are to be pitied and we're not forgiven. In other words, if I had the femur of Jesus in my backpack over there, well, number one, I'd be rich. Number two, Christianity would be false. Christianity is based upon a single testable event in history that we can actually examine the evidence for it. So I said to these students, I said, if you're on a spiritual quest, shouldn't you at least begin by examining the religion that is testable? Shouldn't you begin with the one that's not a matter of blind faith, that's not a matter of feelings, but it's actually a matter of something you can investigate and you can consider the claims for yourself? See, Jesus gave public evidence, didn't he? He walked on water. Jesus healed people. Jesus rose from the dead, and ultimately he rose himself from the dead, the scriptures say. That's why in John 20, verse 31, it said, now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But they are written so you may believe Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and by believing you may have life in his name. I said to these students, you realize Christianity is actually calling you to put the claims to the test and see if they're true. That's why Jesus said, love God with your heart and with your soul and love God with your mind. Think Christianly. Now, this is very different than other religions of the world. Take, for example, Islam. Muhammad did no miracles. He did none. In fact, the only miracle that the Quran talks about is the writing of the Quran itself. If you ask your Muslim friends the question, they'll say, it's so beautiful it must have come from God. Well, how do you judge beauty of a literary text? That's very, very subjective. And actually, when Muhammad would receive the Quran, originally he would go into a cave. He was totally alone. He would actually shake violently all over, foam at the mouth. And originally, he thought he was being attacked by demons. His first wife talked him out of it and said, no, it's the angel Gabriel. God is talking to you. He came out, he gave a revelation, and he persuaded people because Muhammad was obviously very bright. He was a great military ruler. He was a great government leader. But he gave no public evidence that his claims were true, that we can investigate. Do you see the difference between the claims of Christ and the claims of Muhammad? I'll give you another example. I like to take my students on different mission trips. I'm at Biola, but again, I teach one high school class, and I take students on mission trips. So recently, I actually took my students to Salt Lake City, and it's really fun to take students in pairs to spread throughout the city, knock on doors, and say, hey, we're Christians, you have time to talk about Jesus. Because even when they don't have time, the Mormons are like, yeah, I did that to you. Come on in, let's talk about Jesus. And my son, who's 9 now, last year we had a group of about 25 high school students in Salt Lake City. And we were knocking on doors around BYU, and a man answered the door who had just graduated. Very kind, very insightful. We sat down. He was going to work in D.C., in somewhere in the world of politics or law. Him, my son, and I sat down for an hour and had a conversation. And I said, how do you know that Mormonism is true? And I got the same response I get from all of my Mormon friends. If you read the Book of Mormon, and you have an open spirit, so to speak, or an open heart or an open mind, Moroni 10:4 says, then God will reveal to you that it's true. In other words, it's a subjective, experiential test for the claims of Mormonism. I said, how come we can't go to these museums in Salt Lake City and see any single archaeological remain from the events that happened in the Book of Mormon? When there's not historical evidence, you appeal to experience. What did Jesus appeal to? He said you can experience God directly, but he also did public evidences and miracles we can investigate and we can test. Right? I mean, the story in the Book of Mormon is about these golden plates. You want to go examine the golden plates? Sorry, they've been taken up to heaven. Even in Buddhism, in Houston Smith's World Religions, he has a quote by Buddha, and I'm going to read it to you exactly so I don't mess it up. According to this, Buddha allegedly said, "By this you shall know that a man is not my disciple, that he tries to work a miracle." That's why Zen Buddhism is about emptying the mind. Jesus said, use your mind. Old Testament, come let us reason together. The disciples testified to what they seen and what they had heard. So I said to these students, I said, look, if you're really open-minded and you're seeking truth, shouldn't you just begin by considering the claims of Christianity that you can actually put to the test? Then I said, I got a second reason for you. You should begin your spiritual quest with Christianity. And I asked him this question I'll ask you. If you're going to buy a car, what criteria do you think makes sense to buy a car? This is the participatory part of the program. Gas mileage, safety. Does it turn on? Great place to start. I heard color. Okay, someone said kind of the obvious. Price, right? If you're flipping through some website that has cars and you narrow it down to 3 and one is $50,000, one is $25,000, and one is free. Where would it at least make sense to look first? The one that is what? The one that's free. Why pay for something if it's free? I mean, that's logical. You know, all of our parents probably at some point said to us, they gave us the advice that said nothing valuable in life is free. You know the irony? If Christianity is true, the single most valuable truth in the universe is free. It's only in Christianity that salvation is a free gift from God. I said to these students, I said, if you're really seeking truth, doesn't it at least make sense to begin with the religion in which salvation is free? I mean, look what Paul writes, and you were sharing from Ephesians earlier, Ephesians 2:8-9. For by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not your own doing, it is the gift of God, not the result of works, so no one can boast. Look, contrast that with Islam. This week I had a long conversation with a Muslim that I met. And one of the differences we saw clearly is he said, I don't believe in grace. You earn your salvation, you are judged on your own works. Surah 17:13 says, for we have made every man's actions cling to his neck, and he will bring forth to him on the resurrection day a book that is wide open. If Islam is true, we stand before Allah, and our good and bad deeds will be put on a scale. And if our good deeds outweigh our bad deeds, then Allah will likely, there's no guarantee of salvation, but will likely give you eternal life. The same is true within Mormonism. Mormonism has a verse in 2 Nephi 25:23. It says, for it is by grace you have been saved after all that you can do. I was sharing this with a group of these students, and in this smaller group, there's about 8 or 10 kind of skeptics. And this one guy to my right, I'll never forget, he's about 6'4" with the afro, who's at least 6'9". White guy, I mean, just hair went up like this. And he stops me and he goes, you know what? He goes, your arguments are so bad. If I didn't know any better, I would think that you were stoned on crack. He said, I'm taking a class on Buddhism. And in a form of Buddhism called Amida Buddhism, the gods offer grace. And I said, you're right. I had also just taken a class on Buddhism, interestingly enough. And in Amida Buddhism, there are certain things that humans cannot accomplish, so the gods come in and help them. I said, but there's a difference between a system which is based upon our works, and the gods come in and bail us out when we can't do it, and a system that is entirely based upon a free gift in which our works contribute nothing to salvation. These are entirely different. One of the things my students noticed when we came back, they're like, man, that guy really went after you. I said, you know what? I said, hurt people hurt people. For somebody to come out so aggressively and insult me so deeply, he's been hurt somewhere. He's been hurt. And when we keep that in mind, I think we can have a little more grace with people that treat us that way. Jesus certainly did. I told these students, I said, if you're on a spiritual quest, begin with Christianity because you can test it. Second, salvation is free. That's a pretty good deal. You know, it's kind of funny and somewhat sad to admit, but I don't know that grace clicked for me until I was in seminary. I guess it's better late than never. But I had this class at night on biblical languages, Hebrew and Greek, and it was like a 3-hour class. And as the class started, the professor had a different student, and there's about maybe 15 or 20 of us, share a devotional at the beginning before we kicked off class. And I'll never forget this guy, Johnny, who's a filmmaker. Starts off class, and he walks around, and he takes $20, and he puts it on everybody's desk. That got my attention. I was a student. That still gets my attention. I live in California. And he comes to the front and he says, first off, I want you to realize this is a gift for you. He said, don't worry, I asked my wife. That was good word right there. And that was about $400 he spent. He goes, this is totally a gift for you. You can do that $20 as you please. You can leave it there. You can spend it, you can burn it, you can give it away, you can do whatever you want to. He said, and realize that costs me something. I'm a student too, and this costs me something. But you all are going to be ministers of God. It's worth a mere $400 to me to make sure you understand salvation is a free gift and you have done nothing to deserve it. I sat there and thought, I get it. Salvation is free. What a powerful thing that sets Christianity apart. Then I say to these students, I said, I have a third thing that I want to run by you. I think you should begin your spiritual quest with Christianity. And he said, because in Christianity, you can actually live like it's true. I said, now I'm not saying all Christians live consistently with it. I said, I'm all too aware of the failings of Christians, myself included, to live up to our own principles. But a part of Christianity is that we will in fact fail because we believe in something called original sin. My point is not that all Christians practice their faith the way they're supposed to, but that Christianity is the kind of system that puts us in touch with reality as it actually is, and we can, in fact, live like it's true. So here's an example. Within Buddhism, a human being is something called anatta, which means a no soul. So they'll think of human being like a flame. If you have a bunch of candles, you pass a flame from one to the next, and it keeps burning, although it's a constantly changing flame. The one truth you can bank on is that nothing stays the same from one moment to the next. All is in constant flux. Now think about this for a minute. What if we actually applied that to human nature and human identity? Can we consistently live as if human identity is in constant flux? Imagine what that would do to our criminal justice system. I mean, not too long ago, I saw a fellow who was charged, he was in his 90s, for crimes committed all the way back in the 40s in Germany as a part of the Nazi Party. If Buddhism was true, can you just imagine his defense? He could stand before the jury and say, look, that was 70 years ago. That wasn't me. And if Buddhism was true, he'd be absolutely correct. That wasn't him. That was a different person that has gone out of existence. But even though his body has changed, even though his beliefs have changed, even though decades have gone on, we still know that that is essentially the same person. The Christian tradition can make sense of this because Jesus said, don't just fear the one who can kill the body, right? But the one who can kill the body. and the soul for eternity. A human being is body that changes, but a soul that remains the same. Our criminal justice system is actually based on the existence of the soul. Another example, one of the most well-known atheists over the past 50 years was Carl Sagan. How many of you watched the Cosmos program? Let me see your hands. Do you know 1 billion people watched this program on PBS 30, 40 years ago, whatever it was? 1 billion people. It was supposed to be science, but the first statement was, the universe is all there is, all there was, and all there ever will be. That's philosophy, not science. Carl Sagan was a staunch atheist and a staunch Darwinist. He believed that all complex human life was the result of this blind, purposeless, material process. So as a result of his Darwinism, he didn't think humans were made in the image of God and unique and different from the rest of the world. In fact, humans have no more value than animals, so he would fight for and contribute to animal rights. If you're a Darwinist, he seems to be acting consistently. But towards the end of his life, he got a rare disease. And the only cure that could be applied to his disease was one that would be based upon experimenting on animals, which would result in the death of these animals. Now, do you see why he's in a bind? His worldview says his value is no more greater than those animals, but his life was on the line. What do you think he did? Absolutely took the medicine, and it prolonged his life. I don't fault him for taking the medicine, but I do have to point out that the problem is with his worldview, because he couldn't live consistently with the idea that humans and animals actually have equal value. We know all creation is good and valuable, but humans are uniquely made in the image of God. I told these students, I said, look, if you're on a spiritual quest, Christianity, you can test it, you can examine it, use your minds, consider the evidence. Salvation is free, and you can actually live like it's true. But then the last thing I said to him, and you should have seen their faces. This is awesome. I said, the reason you should start with Christianity is because Christianity has Jesus at the center. And you know, their looks are like, oh man, we saw it coming, preacher boy. You set us up and now you're sneaking in Jesus, right? They had this look like, you just gypped us. We got taken for a ride. I said, no, you need to hear me out. I said, we tend to think of religious figures and put them in the same category. We take Krishna, we take Muhammad, we take Buddha, we put Jesus there along with the rest. I said, but there's something about Jesus, even if you don't believe he's the Son of God, that you have to recognize is different about Jesus. You see, the one thing that's different about Jesus is that everybody in all the other major religions want to claim Jesus for themselves. You ever notice that? Nobody claims Muhammad outside of Islam. Nobody claims Buddha outside of Buddhism. Nobody claims Krishna outside of Hinduism. But everybody wants Jesus, right? Buddhists say he's an enlightened one. New Agers say he's some kind of guru. Many Jews will say he was a good Jewish teacher. He was just wrong about the whole Messiah thing. Many atheists will say he's a good moral teacher. Muslims say, the Quran itself, that Jesus was born of a virgin, he was sinless, and he did miracles. I said to these students, I said, if you're really on a spiritual quest, shouldn't you begin by exploring the claims of the religious figure that has done more to change lives, change governments, change history than anybody else who stepped on the face of the planet? Begin with the religion based upon that person. And the question is, who is Jesus? I said that was Jesus' entire message. Is he walked around and he really said it's one question that matters more than anything else. Some said he was a drunk. Some claimed he was an orphan and they attacked him in the book of John. We see that. Some said he was demon possessed. Some said he was just a prophet. But Jesus said the question is, who do you say that I am? That's the question. And this conversation with the students was awesome. And I found time and time again when I'm talking with people, I'll say, do you mind if I just share with you some things that make Christianity unique, that make it different? You might choose to believe in Jesus, you might not. But at least understand how Christianity is unique and the message that Jesus spoke. We had a great time with these students. About a year later, one of my friends sent me an email. One of my friends who was there with me, helping me through with this presentation. And he's speaking at a Calvary Chapel church somewhere up north, and this guy comes to see him. He was one of the 8 skeptical students who were there. And he comes in after talking, he goes, hey, and my friend's name was Brett. He goes, hey, do you remember me? And he kind of placed him, actually he emailed him ahead of time and said he wanted to see him there. And at that point he said he remembered him. He came all this distance to tell him that he had been persuaded by the cosmological argument for the existence of God. Now keep in mind, these are Berkeley students, so they're math and science oriented, and this was very important to him. I sat there and I thought, my goodness, this guy, because we treated them lovingly, because we didn't lash back, because we used humor when we could to just kind of lighten the mood and treat them kindly, this guy heard this truth, went and explored it. I don't know where he's at today, but I know God used one small step of us talking with him to get him thinking about the existence of God. And this kid left the church. Maybe he'll see it makes sense and someday come back. Friends, we live in a world that says your religion is fine as long as you believe it. It's true for you, but maybe not true for you. All religions are essentially the same. I hope we've seen tonight clearly that Christianity makes unique and different and compelling claims about the world that no other religion makes. And may we have the boldness, may we have the clarity, may we have the conviction to lovingly speak the truth to our generation. Because despite what we often hear, this generation is on a spiritual quest. They don't always know it because sometimes they're seeking after the next pleasure in life. But underneath that pleasure is there a search for God. They might not know it because they're searching for success. But underneath that is a search for God. They might not know it because they're seeking identity or power or money or fame, but underlying that, because every human being is made in the image of God, is a search to know the Father, to be loved by him, and to experience eternal life. Amen? It's funny. I was just at the Awana National Convention. There's 1,000 high school students. And I got to speak to them. And it didn't cross my mind that there would be some non-believers at an Awana event. Afterwards, a Muslim student came up. We talked 45 minutes, and a skeptic. So what I did is I gave him a copy of a free book, and I just want to throw this out there for you. I'm guessing many of you are familiar with the book my dad wrote, More Than a Carpenter. How many of you have read More Than a Carpenter? My dad wrote this part of his spiritual journey trying to disprove Christianity. He sat down and said, if I could sit down with somebody for just 2 hours and explain to him why I think the Bible's true, Jesus rose from the grave, that Jesus is God, and what that means for your life, here's what I'll do in 2 hours. He never dreamed that tens of million copies would go around the world. And everywhere I go, I hear somebody say that this was a book that God had used to help them on their spiritual journey. A few years ago in 2009, I had a chance to help him update it. It's essentially the book, but we included new objections, expanded his story. The reason I mention that is because if you're here and you're not a believer, maybe somebody dragged you to this and all you heard about was the pie thing last night. And maybe you never made a decision to really believe in Jesus. But if you've come this far, I'm guessing you'd consider yourself open-minded. Can I give this to you, my wife and I, as a gift? More Than a Carpenter simply lays out who Jesus is, why we believe it's true, and what that means for how we live our life. I'm just going to sneak back to my table. If you come up and say, you know what, that's me, I will sign it and be honored to give it to you for free. Now, if you know a skeptic, you got to buy it for him or I'll go broke. But a little book God has used and continues to use with young people, I pray would be one that could help you as well. Friends, let's pray. God, I thank you for this conference. Thank you for the people that come. It's so evident. Their desire to know truth, their desire to serve you, their desire to make difference in people's lives. God, I pray tonight and the next morning, just help it to go as amazing as it's been so far. God, just open their eyes up, give us creativity, give us a passion for this generation. And we love you and humbly come before you, believing that you can use us to make a difference for eternity. Thank you, and we praise in your name. Amen.